AM 1460 WXBR, the talk of Metro South. You're listening to the Metro South Morning Show, PM in the AM. Peter Zimbo here with you on a Wednesday morning. This Saturday night, live from Las Vegas and broadcast on Showtime pay-per-view, boxing's pound-for-pound kingpin, Floyd Mayweather, defends his unified welterweight championship against Marcos Maidana. And the man who will be analyzing the action for Showtime pay-per-view is the man who joins us right now via the telephone. We welcome back to the program Al Bernstein. Al, good morning and welcome back to the program.
Good to be with you guys.
Al, Floyd Mayweather, Marcos Maidana this Saturday. Before this fight was announced, Floyd Mayweather as boxing's not only their best fighter, but also the biggest draw in terms of box office receipts and pay-per-view sales, really holds a lot of the cards as to who he is going to fight, as everyone wants a crack at him, not only for the opportunity to knock him off as the sport's best fighter, but for the opportunity to get the payday that comes along with it. Before this fight was even announced, it came down to Marcos Maidana and Amir Khan, so much so that Floyd Mayweather was doing these non-scientific polls online to see who fans wanted to see him to fight. Ultimately, Maidana got the nod, and I think a lot of fans agreed with his choice, despite the fact that Maidana did lose to Khan in a head-to-head matchup a few years back, but his recent performances have been strong. With that being said, how much of a threat does he pose to Floyd Mayweather?
Well, you're not going to suggest to me those online polls were less than scientific. I'm shocked.
I am going to suggest
shocked,
that.
Mind you. That is the $64,000 question. I do think, what threat does he pose? I think that you're right. Probably most fans said, given the choice between the two, at the end of the day, Maidana, who had just beaten Adrian Broner, who is considered kind of Mayweather light, and has some similarities, at least, to the Mayweather style. They thought, well, he's earned the right to be in this fight. And Marcos Maidana is a very exciting fighter who tries to make all fights exciting. And that's the key element here. If you're going to fight Floyd Mayweather, unless you are, I can think of some people who could outbox him, but none of them are fighting today. For instance, Tommy Hearns could outbox him, could also outpunch him. Ray Leonard might well outbox him. Pernell Whitaker might outbox him, but they're not around today to fight him. So if you're not going to outbox him, what's left for you to do? And at the end of the day, you want to fight the way Jose Luis Castillo did when Mayweather was much younger, and Castillo, I thought, in their first fight, actually won the fight. It was very close by being very aggressive, throwing great volume of punches, and being very aggressive. And you have to do that. Canelo Alvarez, who was the biggest, strongest man that Mayweather had ever faced, fought him the last time out and decided to box him, which I thought was a very bad tactical move. So having said all that, Maidana is aggressive. He does have pop in his punches, and he will go after Floyd Mayweather. And toward that end, that gives us at least a chance to have a fight that resembles Mayweather's fight with Miguel Cotto a few fights back, which was entertaining.
Floyd Mayweather has a very intriguing problem. I guess that his handlers and maybe even himself would call it a good problem. He's so good that no matter who he fights, he's going to be favored against, and there does seem to be a large gap between his talent and the talent of those beneath him that potentially could fight him.
Yeah, it is an issue, and it's one that I think they think of in terms of marketability, and of course, every fight he's in is a pay-per-view fight, so there's a difference between what you can get people to watch and what you can get people to pay for. If you put Floyd Mayweather's fight on over-the-air television, he would get staggering numbers, huge numbers, monstrous numbers. But when you're asking people to pay for it, they need to feel that it's going to be a very exciting match. And the problem is there is a big gulf between him and the current 147-pounders, or in the case of Canelo, it was a 154-pounder that he faced. And so it creates this conundrum when you're looking ahead to a Mayweather fight. Now, he is 37 years of age, and some believe, he's got, 3 fights left after this potentially on the deal he made with Showtime. And so he's in the twilight of his career, but doesn't show any true signs of his skills eroding. So yeah, it's a good problem for them to have. but isn't even so good for them because they have to think in terms of marketability. There is a man on the horizon, in my opinion, who has the physical gifts and the skill set to potentially beat Floyd Mayweather, but he's a fight or two away from fighting him, and that's Keith Thurman, who got a win last week on Showtime Championship Boxing over Julio Diaz.
We'll talk a little bit more about Keith Thurman in a little bit. Let's talk about the most recent performances of Floyd Mayweather and Marcos Maidana right now. Let's talk about Marcos Maidana first, the fight that essentially earned him this crack at Floyd Mayweather. He was an underdog against Adrian Broner, who was thought to have been a pay-per-view star in the making and a future pound-for-pound elite. And Maidana was able to knock him down and batter him in a very entertaining fight from both a boxing sense and a theatrical sense with some of the antics that went on during the ring and pick up a unanimous decision win. What did Maidana do so well against Adrian Broner that he potentially could do against Floyd Mayweather? Or are we comparing apples to oranges here in hindsight 2020? Broner wasn't quite what we thought he was, or maybe not so at that weight as he was moving up from welterweight.
Well, it's a little bit of both. Because was he? I mean, I never felt that Adrian Broner was. I mean, some had him already in their top 10 pound-for-pound list. I felt Adrian Broner going into the Maidana fight was untested. I mean, he really had not faced tremendous opposition, and the two times when he was tested against Daniel Ponce de Leon, who was coming up in weight to fight him back at 135, and against Paulie Malignaggi, he won very close and controversial decisions. So against the two best fighters he faced, one coming up in weight and the other a man who at welterweight, Paulie's an excellent boxer, but not a huge puncher, he didn't really perform that well. I never thought it was a big stretch for Maidana to win that fight. Now, he may not have, but having said all that, fighting Broner, even though I referred to him as Mayweather light, he has some similarities to Mayweather. He certainly is not on Mayweather's level in terms of defensive skills, and just because he uses the shoulder roll doesn't tell you that his style's the same. However, there are some similarities. And so if you were going to fight somebody prior to fighting Floyd Mayweather, I think Broner's the perfect guy to have fought. And since Maidana had success against him, that says something. Now, if you're looking to hang your hat on one or two things, and this will be in my Keys to Victory piece that starts running this week, so I'll give you a little scoop. Maidana has one interesting thing that he does that was very effective against Broner. He throws a lot of jabs to the body, and he does that for the most part to set up the idea that he's going to throw a left hook. And the jab to the body starts out with almost the same motion as the left hook does. And what happens is the line becomes blurred after you've parried a number of those jabs to the body. You then think it's always a jab to the body. And what Maidana does is he switches it up then, and he'll throw a lead left hook to the head. That was how he got the first knockdown against Broner, and then the second knockdown as well. And if you're going to beat Floyd Mayweather, you need to do it with the left hook, not the overhand right. So that's a move that I think we'll see from Maidana in this fight.
The city in which our radio station emanates from is Brockton, Massachusetts, home of the only undefeated heavyweight champion in boxing history, Rocky Marciano. Is it a good tactical decision for Marcos Maidana to fight somewhat Marciano-like? Not go for anything too technical and scientific, but hit Mayweather wherever he can be hit. The arms, the bodies, the elbow, and try to break him down and eventually wear him down to get him out late.
Yeah, well, you do want to be active, and that's where Canelo Alvarez made his mistake. That's where Jose Luis Castillo was able to do well against him. But you don't lose technique when you do that. You are willing to throw a lot of punches, and yes, don't get too concerned that some things are going to land on the arms and places where you don't get credit for the punches. But what you need to do is still be very clever in the way you're attacking Mayweather. You just have to be more aggressive and throw a lot of punches. I just mentioned a ploy that Maidana would use and will use in this fight, and that's good technical boxing. It just happens to be aggressive technical boxing. So he's going to want to use his jab, which he and new trainer Robert Garcia have worked very hard on. So you don't become an unskilled laborer, but what you do is you definitely don't feel like you have to be perfect. If you wait for that perfect punch against Mayweather, it may never be there.
We're chatting with Al Bernstein here on WXBR, Showtime boxing analyst. He'll be ringside Saturday night for the Floyd Mayweather-Marcos Maidana pay-per-view broadcast. We talked about Marcos Maidana's most recent performance against Adrian Broner. Let's talk about Floyd Mayweather's most recent performance against Canelo Alvarez. He just looked spectacular in virtuoso-like in outboxing, who was thought to have been the biggest threat that could have faced him at that time for both competitive and political reasons. Your analysis of the fight in retrospect, there was great demand for it going in, but Floyd Mayweather just showed that he was in another class.
Yeah, I mean, we had this young champion who was a weight division above him. He probably fought Floyd Mayweather 2 fights too early. But he wanted that. You have to give Alvarez credit. You know, he's wanted the big fights. And if you look at now the level of competition he's fought in recent fights, you know, he fought Austin Trout, excellent fighter, fought Mayweather, fought Alfredo Angulo, and now he's going to be fighting Erislandy Lara in July. So he has been willing to fight the best, and now he's getting the opportunity. But it was probably a little too early for him, and he made a very bad tactical decision to box with Mayweather. When you're the biggest, strongest man that Mayweather has faced, you really want to use that to your advantage. But Floyd looked excellent. You know, he showed this kind of defensive skills that we have seen from him in the past. He was able to land punches. He was able to get in his lead right hand, which is a very important weapon for him. Throw combinations and, you know, befuddle Alvarez for the most part throughout the fight. Every Floyd Mayweather fight takes a similar pattern. The first 2 rounds, maybe 3, the opponent he's facing tries out the things that he thinks will work. Some work a little bit, some not so much, but Floyd Mayweather, who's kind of like the Borg on Star Trek, adapts then. And once he adapts, from rounds 3 through 8 or 9, even though he's in the pocket, he's not running from you, he's winning those rounds and winning them pretty decisively. And then once we get to round 10, he's built up a cushion that now he can be Floyd Mayweather, the consummate boxer, use movement, and now he's wanting to he's already salted away what he thinks is the fight, and now he's going to try and win those rounds, but win them fighting as a businessman.
The Trekkies will like that reference you just made moments ago, Al.
Well, I hope so, and as a Trekkie, I have allegiance to the Star Trek brand.
We're chatting with Al Bernstein here on WXBR. Making Mayweather's win over Canelo Alvarez all the more impressive, I think, was Alvarez's most recent fight where he fought Alfredo Angulo, and Alvarez played the role of the boxer in that fight, completely outclassing his opponent with boxing skill. And when you saw just how easily Floyd Mayweather was able to outbox him, and then you saw how easily Alvarez was able to outbox a formidable foe like Alfredo Angulo, it just showed you the skill level of Floyd Mayweather and where he's at this point.
Yeah, it also demonstrated, though, how flawed Alvarez's strategy was against Mayweather. Even though he was a skilled boxer against Angulo, he was an aggressive fighter. He came forward for much of that fight. You know, Angulo pressed forward for parts of it, but Alvarez was willing to get in the trenches and battle with him, but did so in a very skillful way. That's what he should have done to Floyd Mayweather Jr. That's what he'll do against Erislandy Lara if he's smart, who is a boxer. He will walk to him, which is what Angulo did when he fought Lara and almost had Lara beaten before an eye injury stopped the fight. So, yes, but it did demonstrate, as you point out, that, you know, Mayweather is, you know, his skill set at this juncture is a cut above the people that he could face.
We're chatting with Al Bernstein here on WXBR. He'll be ringside Saturday night for Floyd Mayweather versus Marcos Maidana on Showtime at pay-per-view. Al, in these past few years, you've had the best seat in the house for some of boxing's biggest events. And in all honesty, 4 or 5 years ago, Showtime was not home to boxing's biggest events. It would get some big fights, and boxing fans certainly went to Showtime as a destination to watch some good fights, but it didn't have the big mega pay-per-views, whereas in recent years, Showtime seemingly has been either on par or eclipsing what was the standard bearer for boxing on premium cable television, HBO. You've got to be completely pleased with the quality of fights that Showtime has broadcast in. As a result, you've been able to broadcast ringside over the past 12, 16 months or so.
Yeah, Showtime, I got to Showtime in 2003, and one of the things that I can say has been the hallmark of during that virtually all that time is the fights have been good and competitive. It was a steady rise in terms of the level of fights and the competitiveness and how they resonated with boxing fans. And over the last 5 or 6 years especially, I think it has continually moved forward. But it got kicked into another notch above when after Manny Pacquiao was on our network, we had a pay-per-view with him and Mosley. Pacquiao went back to HBO. Ken Hirschman left after a very successful run at Showtime, went over to HBO. And I think those two events set in motion Les Moonves and the CBS folks who own Showtime, and of course Showtime's management, saying, you know what, we're gonna kick this up a notch, and we're going to. They were planning on it in any case, we're hoping to keep Pacquiao as a big part of what they did, and instead they kicked it up a notch, went after Mayweather, went after Canelo, and in the year 2013 especially, put on what I consider to be the best and most exciting slate of fights that has been on any network in the last 25 years. And in fact, the whole sport in 2013, including HBO and other places, had fights that made that the best year boxing's had in 25 years. So, yes, everything got pushed a notch above. Not only are we having entertaining and competitive fights now, we are also having ones that are just as important, or even some cases more so, than our competitors. And it's been a joy to do it. I've been at this for over 30 years, and I've done boxing on every single level. The ESPN series that we had for all those years, which is a great series.
Hey, our fine folks in Brockton once chanted expletives at you at a broadcast here.
They did, yes. That was in my book. But even though I love your area, as I pointed out, there may have been some alcohol involved in that.
I would think so.
It's barely possible. Yeah, that's funny. And so I've been at it at every level, and this has been a great run.
Now, you mentioned this is one of the best years that boxing has had in 25 years. With that being said, there still are some fights not being made. And Al, I swear I try to avoid this question when I do boxing interviews because I'm quite frankly sick of it, and I don't want it to be the narrative of our interview. But with that being said, there was some news this week. The fight that people have wanted to see for many years has been Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao. And whether it is the fight now that would have been 3-4 years ago, that's open to debate, probably not.
Right.
But with that being said, it's still a fight that people want to see,
sure.
And it would be a massive pay-per-view attraction. Golden Boy Promotions, who works more or less exclusively with Floyd Mayweather, and Top Rank Promotions, who is the promoter of Manny Pacquiao, have outright refused to work with each other in recent years, as they have a whole plethora of issues with one another, which result in them not wanting to do business with each other. Earlier this week, it was reported that there was a bit of a clash of heads amongst the folks at Golden Boy in the top, former world champion Oscar De La Hoya and the CEO Richard Schaefer, as they were debating amongst themselves internally whether or not to do business with Top Rank, which could bring about the Floyd Mayweather-Manny Pacquiao fight. Now, I know we're getting really inside here, but what's the vibe you get? Is that something that could happen, say, within the next 12 months, 2 years?
Well, there is a difference of opinion at this point, I think, in the Golden Boy camp. To what degree, how it plays itself out remains to be seen, but Oscar De La Hoya seems more willing to bury the hatchet with Bob Arum and figure out a way to do business in some of these fights than Richard Schaefer does. it is a complicated history between the two organizations, and thrown into the mix are at various times the network affiliations that they've had, and then there's Floyd Mayweather as a separate entity in this, because he's not really run by Golden Boy or controlled by Golden Boy, even though they're the promoters that he's used on these shows. So there's a lot of interpersonal dynamics that go into this. But the one thing about Golden Boy and Top Rank that is true, when you take the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight out of the equation, there are many other fights that could be made between the fighters that are under contract to those two organizations. And it hasn't been as big a problem for boxing in the last year or two because intramurally, if you will, each organization, with some of the fighters that are promoted by smaller promoters, they've all been able to make great fights that fans love. But there will reach a time, and we may be getting close to it, where that isn't possible anymore, where you can't do it. You know, each side has exhausted the possible matchups, and that's when boxing fans won't be so tolerant of the fact that a Tim Bradley can never fight a Amir Khan, or Floyd Mayweather could never fight a Manny Pacquiao, or et cetera, go on down the list. And I think that, it is, you made the point, you weren't looking for that to be the narrative of this conversation, and that's a fair statement. But I do understand people asking the question because it is a part of the landscape of boxing. Boxing's different than every other sport in that regard.
Now, I mentioned earlier that a potential Floyd Mayweather-Manny Pacquiao fight circa 2014, probably not as big as it would have been, say, 3-4 years ago when both guys were running extended winning streaks. Manny Pacquiao has since lost twice, including once by crushing knockout to Juan Manuel Marquez. With that being said, when you take a look at boxing and some of the mega fights from a historical perspective, Sugar Ray Leonard versus Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield, those fights happened probably a few years after when they were most marketable. In the case of Sugar Ray Leonard, it was because he was retired with an eye injury. Mike Tyson was incarcerated. How diminished is that fight between Pacquiao and Mayweather, if at all?
Well, ironically, and you phrased it well, probably not too much, because fans are curious about it. Now, had Manny Pacquiao lost to Tim Bradley, that would have been difficult. Let's just say, for example, that Pacquiao has one more fight, and if he should win it, he's supposed to fight the winner of Juan Manuel Marquez and Mike Alvarado, the fight that's happening on May 17th. And let's just say the fight was still alive at that point, and let's say Mayweather beat Marcos Maidana. Well, I don't think it would be that diminished. People would be interested because the casual boxing fan, who would make up a big portion of the people that would buy that fight, would only know that these fighters are winning, and boy, we've always wanted to see that. And for the hardcore boxing fan, even if they have decided, for instance, that Pacquiao's a bigger underdog than he would have been 3 years ago, they're still going to want to see that fight. So probably, ironically, the marketability of the fight hasn't diminished that much.
We're chatting with Al Bernstein here on WXBR. Marcus Maidana challenges Floyd Mayweather this Saturday. Al, you mentioned earlier in the interview you feel the biggest threat potentially on the horizon for Floyd Mayweather is an up-and-coming welterweight by the name of Keith Thurman. What do you see in Keith Thurman that makes you think he can be a viable threat for Floyd Mayweather?
Well, Keith Thurman, there's a couple of things about Keith Thurman that's very special. He's 25 and he's already a veteran. He's been fighting for 5 years or so, 6 years maybe, and he has developed all along the way. He was always a murderous puncher, was thought of as primarily a knockout puncher, but with Dan Birmingham, who's a superb trainer who formerly trained Winky Wright, Jeff Lacey, and a number of other fighters, and was a trainer of the year on a couple of occasions, he has honed his skills, and I think honed them to the point where he is the very definition of the word boxer-puncher. He's strong, he's young, and he gets better every fight. And we saw it against Julio Diaz, a veteran who had just given Amir Khan fits some months ago. And before that, he'd lost to Sean Porter, but before that, it had a draw with Porter that many thought he could have won. So here's a guy not very far removed from taking two of the other major welterweights, one of whom, Sean Porter, is a champion. And barely losing to them, and he got destroyed by Keith Thurman. Thurman he has power, he has technical skills, and I believe that he needs one more fight against good opposition, really good opposition, to get himself to the point where he would be a viable contender against Mayweather. And I believe he's the only 147-pounder that I see on the horizon who has the skill set and physical abilities to give Floyd Mayweather a real struggle.
You mentioned he's the only 147-pounder, meaning welterweight, that you see on the horizon that could give Floyd Mayweather trouble. Floyd Mayweather, at times, usually in high-profile fights against marketable opponents, where he got them either at the right time, whether they be on the downside or on the way up, not quite at the level of him yet. He has jumped up to 154 pounds, the junior middleweight division. The three instances that come to my head are De La Hoya, Cotto, and Alvarez. So I don't think he's a full-fledged junior middleweight. I think he's a welterweight. But with that being said, he has tested the waters at junior middleweight from time to time. And I ask this question because of where we are based geographically here in New England. And while this fight has not been talked about too much, if at all, on a national level, some local people are starting to pound the drum for it. And that is Demetrius Andrade from Providence, Rhode Island, reigning junior middleweight title holder, to fight Floyd Mayweather at 154 pounds. Now, I don't think it's a likely fight to happen, but let's say it does. What do you think Demetrius Andrade's chances are against boxing's pound-for-pound kingpin?
Well, from an experience level, even though he had great amateur experience and he's done well as a pro, it's a real stretch at this juncture for him, in my humble opinion. He's a very good fighter, and he's a developing fighter. And I think we need to see a lot more from him to know whether he would be up to that kind of a challenge. Now, as you point out, the weight advantage, the fact that he's a true 154-pounder, you could look at that and say that's significant, but it wasn't significant for Canelo Alvarez, who's clearly a very good fighter at that weight class. And mostly Floyd has fought people that have gone up to 154, except for Alvarez, who clearly was at that weight. And I think the problem is that fight, from a marketing standpoint, probably isn't really there because, to be perfectly, honest, Andrade just doesn't have that big a reputation yet.
And like I said, not talked about at all on the national level, though some of the locals are pounding the drum because Mayweather has tested the borders of junior middleweight.
I appreciate that. You try to get your man the biggest fight you can get, and because of the weight thing and Mayweather, finding that as maybe an interesting thing to move up, I get that. I just don't think it's likely.
It's Al Bernstein, Showtime boxing analyst. He will be ringside this Saturday night for Floyd Mayweather versus Marcos Maidana. Also a very interesting undercard. Luis Collazo takes on Amir Khan. Adrian Broner will be in action against Carlos Molina. Excellent undercard, which you haven't always gotten on pay-per-view shows in recent years.
Except I have to be honest, we have had some really good ones in the last couple of cards we've done. The two Mayweather cards, and we've been very conscious of trying to make that undercard work, and I think this is going to be one of them.
Well, Al, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program this morning. I want to remind the folks the fight is this Saturday night. Also want to remind them that you have a book available, 30 Years, 30 Undeniable Truths About Boxing, Sports, and TV, available at Amazon, amongst other places. Any final words for our listeners before I let you go, Al?
Well, just that I think hopefully we're going to have a fun evening on Saturday night. I do think the Collazo-Khan fight is going to be spectacular, and potentially could provide an upset. I don't know that it will, but that one I think should be a lot of fun, plus Love and Parabon. And if folks want to see my continuing coverage of the fight and others as well, they can go to boxingchannel.tv. I'm the executive producer of that channel. And on the Internet, they can go to boxingchannel.tv and get my other perspective on the fights.
The follow-up to your book will be Undeniable Truths About Boxing, Sports, and Media, because TV, people consume media through the Internet almost more often than they do TV at this point.
You're right. I know we're in a pioneering stage here where, things are changing. And I joked with somebody the other day, and I don't know how you are. I find myself, we have Netflix, of course, like most people do, and Hulu, and we have it plugged into the TV, and I was saying we watch Netflix more than we watch any network.
I think I'm the same way. YouTube is my prime destination for viewing pleasure.
Me too. I'll just punch your name in and say, well, what should we watch today? Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing. And that's part of the reason why I got involved in the boxing channel, because I felt that's where boxing fans are going for a lot of their boxing news and video as well. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Well, Al, have fun this Saturday night. We'll be watching.
All righty, take care.
That's Al Bernstein joining us here on WXBR. We'll step aside for a quick news break. Stick with us here on WXBR.